Alright, so the next video in the Can It Win Game of the Year type of series is Nioh 2. One thing that surprised me was the reception of Nioh 2, and I'm just totally confused by it. But before we get into today's video, the latest Runeterra patch, Legends of Runeterra, the game based on League of Legends, released today. Having a lot of fun with it. Cards are fucking broken, but I am addicted to the game, so I'm having a lot of fun with that. Also, the NBA has been postponed. When they announced the bubble, the immediate thought into my head was that they put some of the most, if not the most, prominent African American figures into a bubble, essentially, and took their voice away. I thought it was a real shame. I really just hope something comes out of this worthwhile. I like sports as much as the next guy, but I definitely would rather social reform than ever watching a sporting event again. Now, on for some more lighter news. Nioh 2, Can It Win Game of the Year?
Yo, it's the GrownKID talk show. Yo, it's the GrownKID talk show. Yo, GrownKID talk show.
Starting off as always with IGN, Nioh 2 review, Hurts So Good, by Michelle Saltzman. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I died a grand total of 409 times during my first playthrough of Nioh 2. You played it a second time, Michelle? Every death is a lesson, which is appropriate because there is a lot to learn in this excellent sequel to one of the first great non-From Software Souls-like games. Nioh 2 takes everything the original game built and evolves it magnificently, adding all sorts of new nuances to the combat, but every gift it gives you is balanced with a stiff backhand slap of difficulty to keep your ego in check. Before we move on to the next piece, to be honest, Nioh 2 does not make that many more adjustments to the original Nioh. While the original Nioh was a good game, this is totally a skippable Souls clone. It took about 55 hours to beat Nioh 2, and every single hour of gameplay was challenging. None of the main missions ever felt insurmountable or made me think that I need to grind in order to overcome them. However, some of the submissions definitely skirted a little too close to the line between difficult and unfair. Now, see, I have a problem with this person already complaining about the difficulty in the side missions. The main appeal of Souls-likes, not just Nioh 2, is that it skirts with that line between difficult and unfair. That is the appeal. Let's get to the grade because I'm already just kind of annoyed, and it got a 9 out of 10 and editor's choice. Amazing. Nioh 2's many systems may be a little overwhelming, but the stellar combat and satisfying difficulty make it worth it. Just to put this in perspective for you, Final Fantasy VII Remake got an 8 out of 10. I ask you, the viewer of this video, what is a better game, Nioh 2 or the Final Fantasy VII Remake? Alright, let's keep it moving with Games Radar. Nioh 2 review makes bold forward strides where it really counts. John Bayless on March 10th, 2020. Games Radar does a pros and cons list. I really do like the pros and cons list as it definitely makes things accessible for people who really don't want to read. The cons are some missions go on too long and too much pointless loot. The pros, supremely polished combat system, the new weapons are great to use, some finely crafted locations, amazing boss encounters. To me, I think the whole of the game went on too long. Given that the story is in the vein of a Souls-like, there is some things left up to interpretation, scenes cut out on purpose because that is the Souls genre, which I think needs to change as a whole for the genre itself to kind of advance. Turning in that loot makes it so that you never have to really grind like we heard from IGN. The combat system is exactly the same from Nioh 1, so it's not exactly innovative. However, they have polished it, so that is correct. I honestly couldn't tell you what one of the new weapons was. It's been so long since Nioh 1 original, and the main draw of these Souls-like games are the bosses, so we expect those to be amazing. Even with the whole idea that the game is great so far in the review, the writer does have something negative to say, and it is funny that it does correlate as well with our previous Final Fantasy VII video, in that they talk about yet even with its advancements over the first game, including more enemy types, Nioh 2 is still too big with too much filler. Missions could drag, certain environments such as settlements or wooden huts, military barracks, and grimy dungeons are repeated too often, and the same old shortcut devices, doors locked from the other side or ladders that need kicking down, are overused. At times, progress slips into a bland routine as you find a shrine, follow a path, slaying monsters, killing a tricky enemy to unlock a shortcut back, then take the next path. I can guarantee you that the filler in Nioh 2 was way more apparent and abrasive than it was in Final Fantasy VII Remake. So then I asked the question, how can the game still score a 4.5 out of 5 on the game's radar scale? Nioh 2 might play it safe in some respects, but the fluidity, depth, and intensity of its combat is incredible. What you have to consider is that Nioh 2 is a sequel. In fact, it uses all of the same mechanics from the first game, the same world even. It's a prequel. The depth of the combat was so amazing that the game gets a 4.5. What have I always said about video games? The most important thing is the story of the game. There is nothing that is more paramount to that. But that is not how Nioh 2 works, which if you believe that there's too much filler, then that combat by default gets repetitive. And then when you mention that there's too much pointless loot, so now what? You're still left with a 4.5 out of 5? What the fuck, Games Radar? Even though Metacritic has so many problems intrinsically with how they allow people to review games, it often gives us the fairest score for that video game once we average both of the scores together. The Metascore got an 85 and the user score a 7.8. It is very interesting that there is a divide here and that the Metascore is on the lower end from both IGN and Games Radar. The users are probably in line with what I believe at a 7.8, and even then I probably think that's too high. So let's look at a couple reviews. Stayarius. I've been playing hard, challenging games since the 80s. I've beaten all the Ninja Gaiden games by the same guys that made Nioh, all the Souls games, etc, etc. I don't say this to brag, but to give a bit of relevance to my statement that the Nioh games are unfair and unbalanced, Nioh 1, the third boss, was the first boss that I played and tried a few times, then just stopped. This person is a longtime gamer, and they do have a penchant for the Souls-like Ninja Gaiden type of games. They're saying that it's unfair. To be honest, the idea of unfair and unbalanced in Nioh, to me, is absolutely ridiculous. I think they're whining and complaining, just like this Stayararis guy. I don't give a shit that you played the games in the 80s, your context sucks, and you gave the game a 4 out of 10, which the game is clearly not a 4 out of 10, so therefore, when you do this kind of trolly shit, even though you want to be genuine and talk about yourself and give perspective, because you graded so low, I can no longer take your statement as being credible. The game is not a 4 out of 10. However, it brings up the unfair and unbalanced part, which we had heard in IGN, and personally, I've played all of the same games this guy mentions, except for the Ninja Gaiden stuff, because it just didn't interest me, and by far, Nioh is the easiest to pick up and the easiest to play. The fact that you couldn't get past the third boss in the first game, and you're using that criteria to then grade the second Nioh is just dumb. Another user score, John Bjorn. It feels like Nioh 1.5 more than a sequel. A lot of reused textures, music, and even some levels. I tried to get through it, but it just doesn't feel balanced and fun as the original. This is what I was talking about when the original Nioh was very niche. This is a perfect explanation of what Nioh 2 is. It really is just Nioh 1.5. Nioh just does not do enough new things to keep that momentum from the first. If anything, they should have went even more niche and made it for like the occult Souls-like fans. Instead of trying to go so broad strokes, I really felt like they lost these hardcore players and what they enjoyed about the original game. So I think John Bjorn is on the money here, even though I think a 5 out of 10 is a little low. Video Chums gave the game an 85. Nioh 2 is one of the most improved sequels to a game that I've ever had the pleasure of playing. With top-notch gameplay and highly rewarding open-ended character progression systems, I simply can't wait to see how Nioh 3 is going to turn out. I have to really disagree with Video Chums here. I don't believe that it is top-notch. I don't think it's AAA game. It's probably a really good AA game. I personally didn't enjoy the story in this one, and the real reason is that ending, and a lot of aspects felt a little rushed and definitely felt not as mature as I wanted them to be, especially when it comes to your friend character, Tankichiro. I thought it would have been more beautiful in that his greed was actually part of his character, and when he turned into a yokai, that was him. But they kind of really just passed it off entirely as him being possessed, which again, cool, but I feel like the game does a poor job of really going one way or the other on that. They kind of muddy the waters there. I just didn't like it enough to give the game an 85, honestly. Nioh 2 and the annoying joy of fighting through a puzzle game. What if Sekiro but more complex, by Dave Tak. Now, if you want to experience what it's like to play a Souls-like game, specifically Nioh 2 in this case, this is a great review for you because David goes into depth about his feelings about the game. I'm frustrated and I'm pissed off at myself. I've been stuck in this dance with this particularly deadly eyesore since yesterday, and I'm still walking into his trap, still failing to kill the damn thing. So again, why the hell do I do this to myself? That question is my last thought as I respawn and try again. This is when it hits me. I'm playing a puzzle game. This is an interesting take on the Souls-like genre because the bosses are so difficult and sometimes the enemy level traversal can be hard and often annoying to do at times because Nioh 2 doesn't innovate too much in that regard. They equate it to a puzzle game where you just have to figure out the best route and the best thing to do to accomplish your goal. I like this analogy a lot. The part I'm just kind of like about this review is the fact that this person's writing so emotionally about his feelings to Nioh 2, and we've heard this song and dance plenty of times before because, newsflash, Souls-like games are not new. So I didn't really appreciate this kind of writing style in terms of talking about the game, as I think it's implied by now you have to approach Souls-like games by just not button mashing. Even though Nioh 2 almost entices you to button mash, you'll never get the result that you need in these types of games by doing that, even though there are tons of memes about L1 spams or block spams. However, for the majority of people, this experience is true if it's your first Nioh, if it's your first Souls-like, but this experience quickly leaves after a little bit time in that genre. I don't think a game has ever asked as much from me as Nioh 2. Yet still I return because if a game is going to be this demanding, it had better be fair. And Nioh 2 is always fair, even if it often feels like just a little too much. It's a puzzle game, it's baking bread, it's everything that yields rewards only after you learn to think differently and learn consistency and focus. And I'm getting better at it, I'm getting wise. I want to point out a few things here because this person is on the money when they talk about that the game is always fair. The complaints that you heard about the game being unfair are just wrong and from whiny gamers, honestly. I don't think a game has ever asked as much from me as Nioh 2 tells me that this person does not play Souls-like games. To me, there have been plenty of other games that asked more from me than Nioh 2. In fact, I think it's quite comical that this person even thinks that, but I want to give this person the benefit of the doubt that this is their first Souls-like experience. And I think Nioh 2 excels at that idea of a first timer. However, it falls flat for everybody else. And so we have to give Polygon and Kotaku grades, and I say this every time, you really should check out Kotaku and Polygon even though they don't give a letter or numbered grade, but we assign a grade, and I do believe Dave Tak, considering the language he talked about and the fact that the game demanded so much of him and he thought the game was fair and found delight in the annoying joy of fighting through a puzzle game, I really do think that Dave would be super high on the game, in between an 85 and a 95, and we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt and give him a 90, which is a very high score that I don't necessarily agree with, but I try to be as fair as possible. Nioh 2, the Kotaku review by Heather Alexandria Alexandria. I have seen the name Heather Alexandria a few times, and I'll be interested to hear what Heather has to say. One of the best things that Kotaku does, kind of similar to Games Radar, is they give a little breakdown. Back of the box quote, if the bird doesn't sing, I'll simply kill the bird. Type of game. You are with swords what Mozart was to music. I think that's quite a bit of an overstatement. What they liked about the game, combat is incredible, bosses are strikingly designed, the story is an improvement over the first game. Kind of. The combat is okay. It is definitely not incredible, because incredible is a word that describes something truly great. Disliked. Level design is a little bit boring. A few bosses whose gimmicks don't really work. I like the narrative, but the storytelling is messy. This is true. The storytelling is messy. In fact, the Nioh 1 story might be better in that it doesn't take itself too seriously, whereas Nioh 2 just thinks it's the fucking shit. Nioh 2 is different. You're not a dancer falling in line to a beat. You're not a musician improvising your own flourishes. You're the whole goddamn opera. I feel like a lot of games can be summed up in this way when you have an OP main character. I don't know how much this actually says, besides the idea that it's a Souls game and you have to be a little bit more strategic when you're fighting, which I kind of have to disagree with, because I think Nioh 2 and the Nioh franchise as a whole is one of the looser, just like a Bloodborne, in that your approach to the combat can change, especially in Nioh when you have a lot of iframes and a whole form change. I really do think that you can just kind of flail around in Nioh way more than you can in, say, a typical Dark Souls. Nioh 2 has some glaring flaws in spite of the fantastic combat and challenging encounters. Again, the superfluous language, I know I said that wrong. Chief among them is level design and turns most of the game into a blurry slog. This is true. The level design in Nioh 2 is very bare minimum. I think what's happening here, as what happened with The Last of Us 2 reviews, because the game looks so pretty, we undervalue other aspects of the game heavily, and we decide to pick one mechanic or two mechanics that we deem so great, which they might not actually be in actuality, but we go with that one point and kind of run with it. I always like reading the reviews because most of the time the writer, except for the case of The Last of Us Part 2, will mention negative things about the game. This calls to mind Nioh 2's biggest problem in both the pace of individual levels and storytelling. There's a sense that everything is a half step off. Narratively, Nioh 2 is an improvement over the first game. William Adams' journey is an interesting historical curiosity. He was the first Caucasian foreigner to be granted the title of samurai by the shogunate, but he was a dull protagonist. Nioh 2's player-created hero doesn't have any dialogue lines, but their connection to Takachiro, the direct role in Rise of the Hidoshi, means that the plot flows more naturally. The core cast is likable. Hidoshi's jocularity and cunning develops into a tempered intellect. Nobunaga's strong commands belie a surprising noble character. I do like some of the characters in Nioh 2. Put into this context, I don't think that the mute protagonist is better than William Adams' journey. I actually liked William as a main character a lot more, but that could sometimes come down to preference, right? Do you want to make your own character in a video game, or do you want the character to be given to you and you role play as that character? I personally really like William Adams, and obviously the game did too, because they did a shitty tie-in at the end with William. I'm just super surprised at this Nioh 2 review stuff. We're going to give Kotaku a grade, and I think again falls very high. I just look at the language and the words that are chosen to describe certain things, probably between an 80 and a 90. This is a really hard grade for me to give, and I think I'm gonna go with an 87. I normally only do full or half numbers, but I really do think that the writer really did like this game. Alright, so all our reviews are in. Remember, Metacritic is 2 scores that we averaged together, and we got an 81.5. The 87, the 90, the 90, and then the Games Radar, the 4.5 times 20 comes out to another 90. I would like to say before we do this, these are really high scores and I try my best to be very fair. So we equal those all together, we get this number, we divide that by 5, And our final fair score for Nioh 2 was an 87.7. An 87.7 for Nioh 2, I believe, is an unfair score. I think it is too high, and I want to remind you that the only reason that this score may seem low, considering the 390s we got, is because of that user score mixed into that meta score. That is the only reason why this average became an 87.7, and in our case, we actually round that up to an 88. And now we're going to get to my opinion. The 88 is too high for this game. I don't know why people love the game so much. I can only see it if this was your first Souls-like game. This would be a good entry, but again, it can't be because it's Nioh 2, not Nioh 1. So I have a hard time believing that to be a cause as to why the scores were so high. To put in perspective, Nioh 2 scored higher than Final Fantasy VII Remake. That is just unacceptable. There needs to be a more clearly defined way that games are reviewed, because there are clear discrepancies in gaming journalism. Nioh 2 is by far an inferior to Final Fantasy VII. It is inferior as a Souls-like game, and the only thing positive that all the reviews had to talk about was the combat. No one particularly said that they loved the story. All they said was it was an improvement to the first. But then I brought up the argument that it is a matter of opinion. Do you like to role play as your RPG character, or do you like to make your own? So there, that is null and void to me, and I personally think that the story of Nioh 1 was better, hence why they had to tie it in and made this a prequel, thus hinting at that the next Nioh may actually return to William in the third game along with this protagonist we made in our second. I, for one, will probably be skipping on it. I did not like Nioh enough to continue, because Nioh 2 did not make the franchise better to me. If anything, it pointed out its glaring flaws. It is a one-trick pony because I've seen this before. It is so surprising that they talked about games like Death Stranding and Ghost of Tsushima as I've seen this before, yet these same reviewers give a game like Nioh 2 higher grades. I'm just confused about that. I need more consistency in my gaming journalism, and let me know what you thought. Do you think Nioh 2 can win Game of the Year? I personally do not think it should win, do not think it can win, and that is that. I know the video was long, I know I rambled a little bit, maybe even ranted. I'm the GrownKID, and I catch you back in another video.
Yo, it's the GrownKID Talk Show.